In the opulent halls of Heir Palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath and whisper, King Edmund Blackthorne III stands at the precipice of a decision that will shatter the very foundation of the monarchy. Behind gilded doors and beneath crystal chandeliers, a secret has been festering for 25 years, one that threatens to destroy not just a marriage, but the entire line of succession. When Queen Consort Victoria discovers a hidden letter that reveals her husband's true feelings about their union, she realizes that everything she believed about her place in the royal family was a carefully constructed lie. Meanwhile, Princess Catherine Blackthorne, the king's daughter-in-law, unknowingly holds the key to a legacy that could either save or destroy the crown forever. As palace guards whisper in shadowed corridors and ancient portraits seem to watch with knowing eyes, three women find themselves locked in a battle for the soul of the kingdom. But when the king makes an unprecedented public declaration that sends shockwaves through the realm, the question isn't just who will inherit the throne. It's whether there will be a monarchy left to inherit. In a world where every smile is calculated and every gesture has consequences that echo through generations, love, loyalty, and legacy collide in ways that will leave the royal family and the nation forever changed. Some secrets are worth dying for. Others are worth killing for. And, in the House of Blackthorne, the line between the two has never been thinner. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Heir Palace like secrets refusing to be told. Queen Consort Victoria Blackthorne stood at the towering window of her private chambers, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens below. Each bloom had been planted according to a tradition spanning for centuries. Yet today, even the most beautiful roses seemed to mock her with their perfection. Victoria had always known her place in the royal hierarchy. She was the second wife, the one who came after the beloved Queen Isabella had died tragically young, leaving behind a grieving king and a devastated nation. For 25 years, Victoria had played her role flawlessly, supportive, dignified, never stepping too far into the spotlight that had once belonged to another. She had given the crown everything she had, including her own identity, and yet she had never truly felt like she belonged. The soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding thoughts. Lady Margaret Ashford, her closest confidant and lady-in-waiting, entered with the morning correspondence balanced on a silver tray. Margaret had served the royal family for over 3 decades, her gray hair always perfectly styled, her movements efficient yet graceful. She was one of the few people in the palace who remembered Queen Isabella, and sometimes Victoria caught her staring with eyes that seemed to compare the present to a more glorious past. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, setting the tray on the mahogany writing desk. "The usual invitations and requests. The charity luncheon for the Children's Hospital needs your final approval, and the Prime Minister's office has requested a meeting regarding the upcoming state visit." Victoria nodded absently, her fingers trailing across the leather-bound correspondence folder. Among the formal letters and gilt-edged invitations, one envelope caught her attention. It was cream-colored parchment, expensive but understated, with no official seal or return address. Her name was written across the front in elegant script that she didn't recognize. "What's this one?" she asked, lifting the mysterious envelope. Margaret frowned, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm not certain, Your Majesty. It was among the king's correspondence, but it has your name on it. Perhaps it was misfiled." The envelope felt substantial in Victoria's hands, as if it contained more than just a simple letter. She turned it over, noting the absence of any identifying marks. Something about its very anonymity made her pulse quicken. In a world where every piece of communication was scrutinized and cataloged, an unmarked letter was almost revolutionary. "Thank you, Margaret. That will be all for now." After her lady-in-waiting departed, Victoria settled into the velvet armchair by the fireplace. The autumn chill had begun to creep into the palace walls, and she pulled a cashmere throw around her shoulders before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of the same cream parchment, covered in the same elegant handwriting. As she began to read, the color drained from her face. The letter was dated 26 years ago, just 1 year before Victoria's marriage to King Edmund. It was written in the king's own hand, addressed to his private secretary at the time, Lord Harrison Pembroke. Victoria's hands trembled as she read words that cut through her heart like shards of glass. "My dear Harrison," the letter began, "I write to you in confidence, knowing that you alone understand the burden I carry. Isabella's death has left me hollow, a shell of the man I once was. The kingdom demands that I remarry, that I provide stability and continuity for the crown. They have chosen Lady Victoria Ashworth as a suitable candidate. She is beautiful, well-educated, and comes from an appropriate family. But how can I explain to her, or to anyone, that my heart died with Isabella? This marriage will be one of duty alone. Victoria deserves a man who can love her completely, and I fear I will never be that man. I pray that in time, she will forgive me for the deception that our union will necessarily be. She will be queen consort in title, but Isabella will always reign over my heart. I can only hope that Victoria will find her own purpose in this arrangement, perhaps in the children we may have, or in the good she can do for the realm. But love? True love? That privilege belongs to the past, to a woman who took my soul with her to the grave. Victoria read the letter 3 times before its full meaning sank in. 25 years of marriage, of trying to earn her husband's affection, of wondering why she always felt like she was competing with a ghost. It all suddenly made devastating sense. The king had never loved her. Worse, he had known from the beginning that he never would. She thought of all the moments she had treasured, the quiet dinners when Edmund had seemed almost relaxed, the rare occasions when he had taken her hand during public appearances, the few times he had seemed genuinely pleased by something she had done for the kingdom. Had all of it been performance? Had she been so desperate for crumbs of affection that she had mistaken royal duty for genuine emotion? The fire crackled in the hearth, and Victoria stared into the flames as if they might provide answers to questions she had never dared to ask. She thought of Princess Catherine, her daughter-in-law, who had married Prince William 3 years ago in a ceremony that had captured the world's attention. Catherine was everything Victoria had once been: young, hopeful, radiant with the belief that she could make a difference in the world. More importantly, William clearly adored his wife. The way he looked at Catherine, the way his entire demeanor softened when she entered a room, the way he protected her from the harsh glare of royal protocol whenever possible. It was everything Victoria had dreamed of having with Edmund. But Catherine possessed something Victoria never had: the king's approval and affection. From the moment William had introduced Catherine as his girlfriend, King Edmund had welcomed her warmly. He sought her opinions, included her in important discussions, and treated her with a respect and fondness that Victoria had spent decades trying to earn. Victoria had always assumed it was because Catherine was young and charming, because she represented the future of the monarchy. Now she wondered if there was something deeper at play. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her chambers made Victoria quickly fold the letter and slip it into the hidden compartment of her jewelry box. She had discovered the secret drawer by accident years ago, and it had become her repository for the few truly personal items she owned: a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet, a photograph of her late mother, and now this devastating revelation. King Edmund entered without knocking, as was his habit. At 62, he was still an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that made people instinctively straighten their spines. He wore a dark suit tailored to perfection, and his pale blue eyes swept the room with the efficiency of someone accustomed to taking inventory of everything around him. "Good morning, Victoria," he said, his tone pleasant but distant. "I trust you slept well." "Yes, thank you," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "And you?" "Well enough. I've just come from a meeting with the Archbishop. We were discussing the charity foundation Catherine has proposed for underprivileged youth. It's quite ambitious. She wants to establish educational programs in 12 different cities over the next 5 years. Victoria noted the warmth in his voice when he spoke of Catherine's project. "That's wonderful. Catherine has such a good heart." "Indeed she does. She reminds me." Edmund paused, a distant look crossing his features. "She reminds me of someone I once knew. Someone who also believed that the monarchy could be a force for genuine good in the world." Victoria felt her chest tighten. She knew without asking that he was thinking of Isabella. Even after all these years, his first wife remained the standard by which all other women were measured. "I'm sure Catherine will do wonderful things," Victoria managed to say. "I believe she will. In fact, I've been thinking about expanding her role within the Royal Foundation, perhaps giving her more autonomy, more resources to pursue her initiatives." "That seems very progressive," Victoria said carefully. Edmund's eyes focused on her with sudden intensity. "Progress is exactly what this monarchy needs, Victoria. We cannot continue to cling to outdated traditions simply because they're familiar. The world is changing, and we must change with it or risk becoming irrelevant." There was something in his tone that made Victoria uneasy, as if his words carried a weight beyond their apparent meaning. She had learned to read the subtle signs of her husband's moods over the years. The slight tightening around his eyes when he was frustrated, the way his hands moved when he was deep in thought, the particular cadence of his voice when he had made a decision he knew would be unpopular. "What kind of changes are you considering?" she asked. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to gauge how much truth she could handle. "Significant ones, Victoria. Changes that will affect all of us." Before she could ask for clarification, a sharp knock interrupted them. Prince William entered, looking harried and somewhat out of breath. At 35, the heir apparent had inherited his father's height and bearing, but his dark hair and warm brown eyes came from his mother. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had been groomed for leadership from birth, yet there was an approachability about him that endeared him to the public. "Father, I apologize for interrupting, but we have a situation. The press has gotten wind of something. I'm not sure what exactly, but they're asking very specific questions about palace succession protocols and the king's preferences regarding the future of the monarchy." Edmund's expression didn't change, but Victoria saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about whether you've made any private statements about the line of succession, whether there have been any discussions about bypassing traditional protocols, whether certain members of the family have been given expanded roles or authorities." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She looked between her husband and stepson, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite identify. William's concern seemed genuine, but there was something else in his expression, a wariness that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "How specific were these questions?" Edmund asked. "Very specific, father. They mentioned Catherine by name, asked about her relationship with you, about whether she's been involved in policy discussions typically reserved for direct heirs." Edmund nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "I see. And your response?" "I referred all questions to the palace press office, of course." "But, father—" William hesitated, glancing at Victoria before continuing. "Some of these reporters seem to have inside information, details about private conversations, knowledge of meetings that were supposed to be confidential." The implications hung heavy in the air. Someone within the palace walls was talking to the press, sharing information that could potentially damage the royal family's carefully maintained image. Victoria thought of the letter hidden in her jewelry box, of the devastating revelations it contained. If such private thoughts from the king's past could surface unexpectedly, what other secrets might be waiting to be exposed? "We'll need to be very careful about our public appearances over the next few weeks," Edmund said finally. "Any misstep will be magnified, any gesture misinterpreted." "What about the state dinner next Friday?" William asked. "Should we consider postponing?" "Absolutely not. Canceling would only fuel more speculation. We'll proceed as planned, but I want security protocols reviewed and all staff reminded of their confidentiality agreements." Victoria watched this exchange with growing unease. The easy familiarity between father and son, the way they discussed damage control strategies without including her in the decision-making process, the assumption that she would simply go along with whatever they decided, it all reinforced the sense of isolation that had been building within her for years. After William left, Edmund turned back to Victoria with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I may need to ask you to take on additional responsibilities in the coming weeks. Public appearances, charity events, anything that demonstrates the stability and unity of our family." "Of course," Victoria said automatically. "Whatever you need." But even as she spoke the words, she thought of the letter hidden upstairs, of 25 years spent trying to earn something that had never been available to her. How many more years would she spend performing a role in a marriage that had been built on a lie? How many more public appearances would she endure, smiling and playing the devoted wife, while knowing that her husband's heart belonged to a woman who had been dead for 3 decades? Edmund moved toward the door, then paused. "Victoria, I want you to know that I appreciate your discretion and loyalty over the years. Whatever challenges we face in the coming weeks, I know I can count on your support." After he left, Victoria sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the irony of his words. He was counting on her loyalty, her discretion, her willingness to protect the very institution that had demanded she sacrifice her own happiness for its preservation. And the most bitter irony of all was that she would probably continue to give him exactly what he asked for, because after 25 years, she didn't know how to be anyone other than the dutiful queen consort. But something had changed with the discovery of that letter. A seed of defiance had been planted, and Victoria could feel it beginning to grow. For the first time in decades, she found herself wondering what would happen if she stopped being quite so dutiful, quite so accommodating. What would happen if Queen Consort Victoria Blackthorn finally decided to put her own needs first? The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs. Outside, the roses continued to bloom in their perfect rows, tended by gardeners who knew their place in the grand design of palace life. But, inside, something fundamental was shifting, and Victoria suspected that neither the king nor anyone else in the royal family was prepared for the consequences of the truth finally coming to light. The state dinner preparations began at dawn, transforming the great hall of Heir Palace into a glittering showcase of royal grandeur. Princess Catherine Blackthorn supervised the final arrangements with the kind of attention to detail that had made her beloved by both the palace staff and the public. At 28, she possessed a natural grace that seemed effortless, though Victoria knew it was the result of years of careful training and genuine commitment to her role. Catherine wore a navy blue day dress that complemented her auburn hair, which was pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her sapphire engagement ring, a family heirloom that had once belonged to Queen Isabella, caught the light as she gestured toward the floral arrangements. Victoria watched from the gallery above, noting how the young woman moved through the hall with confident authority, consulting with the head butler, adjusting place settings, and ensuring that every detail reflected the dignity of the crown. "She has remarkable instincts for this work," came a voice behind Victoria. She turned to find King Edmund ascending the stairs to the gallery, his expression thoughtful as he observed his daughter-in-law below. "Yes, she does," Victoria agreed, though she felt a familiar pang of something she couldn't quite name. Jealousy, perhaps, or simply the recognition of opportunities she herself had never been given. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Edmund continued, joining Victoria at the railing, "about the changes that may be necessary for the monarchy's future." Below them, Catherine was speaking with the French ambassador's aide, switching effortlessly between English and French as she discussed the evening's protocol. Her laughter echoed in the vast space, genuine and musical. Victoria noticed how the staff around her seemed to brighten in her presence, how even the most senior courtiers deferred to her judgment without resentment. "She could do it, you know," Edmund said quietly. "Do what?" "Lead. Really lead, not just perform ceremonial functions. She has the intelligence for policy work, the charisma for public engagement, and, most importantly, she has the people's trust." Victoria felt her stomach tighten. There was something in her husband's tone, a definitiveness that suggested this wasn't merely casual observation. "What exactly are you saying, Edmund?" The king was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on Catherine as she directed the placement of the ceremonial silver. "The monarchy survives by adapting, Victoria. Those who refuse to evolve become irrelevant, then disappear entirely. I've spent considerable time lately thinking about what evolution might look like for the House of Blackthorn. And what conclusions have you reached?" Instead of answering directly, Edmund pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "I received this from the constitutional lawyers this morning. It's a comprehensive analysis of succession protocols and the king's discretionary powers regarding the distribution of royal responsibilities and honors." Victoria accepted the document with trembling hands. The legal language was dense, but certain phrases leaped out at her. Unprecedented expansion of consort powers, modification of traditional hierarchies, potential restructuring of inheritance frameworks. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her was beginning to suspect exactly what her husband was contemplating. "The monarchy needs a future, Victoria. William will be an excellent king someday, but he'll need a strong partner. More than that, the institution itself needs someone who can bridge the gap between tradition and progress, someone who can make the crown relevant to a new generation. Catherine is already doing that. To a limited extent, yes. But imagine if she were empowered to do more. Much more." Victoria looked up sharply. "What are you planning?" Edmund turned to face her fully, his expression serious but not unkind. "I'm planning to ensure the survival of everything my family has built over 8 centuries. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions." Before Victoria could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from below. Prince William strode into the great hall, his face flushed with exertion and something that looked like barely controlled anger. He spoke briefly with Catherine, who immediately paled and glanced upward toward the gallery where Victoria and Edmund stood. "We should go down," Edmund said calmly. "It appears William has news." They descended the grand staircase to find Catherine and William standing close together near the massive fireplace, their voices low but urgent. Victoria caught fragments of their conversation, something about newspaper headlines, unauthorized photographs, and palace security breaches. "What's happened?" Edmund asked as they approached. William held up his phone, displaying a newspaper website with a headline that made Victoria's blood run cold. "Palace insider reveals King's secret succession plans. She's his true heir." "How long has this been online?" Edmund's voice remained steady, but Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders. 20 minutes. But it's already been picked up by 7 major news outlets, and social media is exploding. "Father, they have quotes. Specific quotes attributed to you about Catherine's role in the future of the monarchy." Catherine stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Your Majesty, if this is going to cause problems for the family, perhaps I should withdraw from tonight's dinner. Issue a statement clarifying my position." "Absolutely not," Edmund said firmly. "Hiding would only validate their speculation." Victoria studied the faces around her, her husband's controlled determination, William's frustrated concern, Catherine's worried resolve. She felt like an outsider looking in on a family drama in which she had no real role to play. "May I see the article?" she asked. William hesitated, glancing at his father before handing her the phone. Victoria read quickly, her horror growing with each paragraph. The article quoted anonymous palace sources describing the king's unprecedented affection and respect for his daughter-in-law, his belief that she represented the future of royal leadership, and his alleged private statements that Catherine possessed qualities that made her more suited to certain aspects of royal responsibility than others currently in line. Most damaging was a quote attributed to the king himself: "Blood alone doesn't determine worthiness. The crown needs leaders who can inspire, not just inherit." "Did you say this?" Victoria asked, looking directly at her husband. "Not in those exact words, but the sentiment." Edmund paused, choosing his words carefully. "I may have expressed similar thoughts in what I believed were private conversations." "With whom?" "Various advisors, constitutional experts, people whose counsel I value." Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "And what exactly did these private conversations cover?" Catherine moved closer to William, who instinctively put a protective arm around her shoulders. "Your Majesty," Catherine said carefully, "I want to be very clear that I have never sought any role beyond what was appropriate for my position. If there's been any misunderstanding, there's been no misunderstanding," Edmund interrupted. "You've conducted yourself with perfect propriety, Catherine. The fault lies with whoever has chosen to misrepresent private discussions for public consumption." But Victoria was beginning to understand that the public consumption wasn't accidental. Someone wanted this story in the newspapers, wanted the speculation about Catherine's elevated role, wanted the questions about traditional succession protocols. The question was who, and why now? "We need to control the narrative," William said. "Issue a statement reaffirming traditional succession lines, emphasizing Catherine's appropriate role within existing structures." "No," Edmund said quietly. "That would be dishonest." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria stared at her husband, recognizing the expression on his face, the same look he had worn during their most difficult conversations over the years, when he was about to say something that would change everything. "What do you mean, dishonest?" William's voice carried a warning note. "I mean that Catherine's role in this family, her importance to the monarchy's future, cannot be adequately described within existing structures." Victoria felt her heart begin to race. "Edmund, what are you saying?" The king looked around the great hall, his gaze taking in the portraits of his ancestors, the heraldic banners, the symbols of centuries of royal tradition. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I'm saying that tonight, at the state dinner, I intend to make an announcement that will clarify Catherine's position once and for all. I'm going to formally name her as my designated heir in all matters relating to the royal foundation, cultural initiatives, and diplomatic protocol. Furthermore, I'm going to establish a new title for her, Princess Regent, with authority that supersedes traditional hierarchies in specific areas of royal responsibility." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet, leaving her falling through space with no hope of landing safely. "Father," William said carefully, "that would be unprecedented." "Precisely. The monarchy has survived for 8 centuries because my ancestors were willing to make unprecedented decisions when circumstances demanded them." Catherine shook her head. "Your Majesty, I cannot accept such a position. It would be inappropriate. and it would create exactly the kind of constitutional crisis that, what it would create, Edmund said firmly, is clarity. For 25 years, this family has operated under assumptions and traditions that no longer serve the crown's best interests. Tonight, I'm going to establish new traditions that better reflect the realities of modern monarchy. Victoria found her voice at last. And what about me, Edmund? What role do I play in these new traditions? Her husband looked at her with what might have been sympathy, or perhaps simply acknowledgement of an uncomfortable necessity. You will continue to serve as Queen Consort, Victoria. Your position remains unchanged. But they both knew that was a lie. If Catherine became Princess Regent with expanded authority, Victoria's role would be diminished by comparison. She would become the ceremonial wife, while Catherine assumed the substantive responsibilities that Victoria had always hoped might someday be hers. The irony was devastating. For 25 years, Victoria had performed the role of dutiful queen consort, supporting her husband, representing the crown with dignity, and waiting for the moment when her experience and dedication might be recognized with expanded responsibilities. Instead, she was about to watch those opportunities be handed to another woman, a younger woman who had been in the family for only 3 years. This is a mistake, Victoria said quietly. Edmund turned to her with raised eyebrows. I beg your pardon. I said this is a mistake. Creating new titles, bypassing established protocols, making dramatic announcements in front of foreign dignitaries. None of this serves the monarchy's interests. It serves your interests. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. William and Catherine exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. My interests. Edmund's voice carried a warning tone that Victoria had learned to recognize over the years. But, for the first time in their marriage, Victoria didn't retreat. The letter hidden in her jewelry box had changed something fundamental in her willingness to accommodate her husband's wishes at the expense of her own dignity. Yes, your interests. Your desire to mold the monarchy according to your personal preferences, regardless of the consequences for the people who have devoted their lives to supporting you. Victoria, Edmund said carefully, I think perhaps the stress of the situation has clarified my thinking, not clouded it. For 25 years, I have supported every decision you've made, every initiative you've pursued, every change you've implemented. I have never questioned your judgment publicly, never challenged your authority, never asked for recognition or reward beyond the privilege of serving alongside you. And now, when you're about to fundamentally alter the structure of this monarchy, I'm expected to simply smile and applaud while you hand my responsibilities to someone else. Catherine stepped forward. Your Majesty, please, I never asked for. This isn't about you, Catherine, Victoria said, though her tone remained gentle. You've done nothing wrong. This is about a system that values novelty over experience, potential over proven service. Edmund's face had darkened considerably. Victoria, you're speaking out of turn. Am I? Or am I finally speaking honestly for the first time in our marriage? The words escaped before Victoria could stop them, and she saw Edmund's eyes widen slightly. They were venturing into territory that had always been carefully avoided, touching on truths that their relationship had been built on concealing. Perhaps, Edmund said quietly, we should continue this discussion in private. No, Victoria said. I think William and Catherine should hear this, since they're going to be so deeply affected by your decision. She turned to address the younger couple directly. Your Majesty is about to create a situation that will divide this family and potentially damage the monarchy irreparably. Not because Catherine isn't worthy of expanded responsibilities, but because the method he's chosen ignores 25 years of established relationships and proven service. What are you suggesting? William asked carefully. Victoria looked at each of them in turn. Her stepson, whose loyalty was clearly torn between his father and his wife. Catherine, whose discomfort was evident, but who was too well trained to openly object to the king's plans. And Edmund, whose expression had shifted from irritation to something approaching wariness. I'm suggesting that if His Majesty is determined to restructure the monarchy, he should do so in a way that honors the contributions of all family members, not just the one who happens to remind him of someone from his past. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Victoria saw Edmund's face go completely still, and she knew she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I think, Edmund said with dangerous quiet, that you may be allowing personal disappointment to cloud your judgment. Personal disappointment? Victoria felt a laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep and bitter. Your Majesty, personal disappointment doesn't begin to describe what I'm feeling right now. She walked toward the great doors, then paused to look back at the three people who represented everything she had tried and failed to become part of. Tonight's dinner will proceed as planned. I'll smile, play the gracious hostess, and support whatever announcement you choose to make. But afterward, we need to have a very different kind of conversation about the future of this marriage and my place in it. As Victoria left the great hall, she heard Catherine's voice behind her, soft but clear. Perhaps we should postpone the announcement, Your Majesty. Give everyone time to know, came Edmund's firm response. The announcement will proceed as planned. Victoria climbed the stairs to her chambers, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had just done. For 25 years, she had been the perfect royal wife, supportive, dignified, never causing problems or creating scandals. In the space of 10 minutes, she had shattered that carefully maintained image, and she wasn't sure whether she felt liberated or terrified by the change. One thing was certain, tonight's state dinner would be unlike any royal event in recent memory. And tomorrow, the House of Blackthorn would wake up to a very different world than the one they had known before. The evening air in Heir Palace crackled with tension as guests arrived for the state dinner. Victoria stood before her dressing mirror, allowing her lady-in-waiting to fasten the diamond necklace that had been a wedding gift from Edmund 25 years ago. The stones caught the light from the crystal chandelier above, creating tiny rainbows across the surface of her emerald green gown. She had chosen the dress deliberately. It was regal, sophisticated, and made her look every inch the queen consort she had worked so hard to become. Margaret Ashford moved with practiced efficiency, but Victoria could sense her nervousness. Word of the afternoon's confrontation had undoubtedly spread through the palace staff with the speed that only servants' gossip could achieve. Your Majesty looks magnificent, Margaret said, stepping back to survey her work. Thank you, Margaret. Victoria studied her reflection critically. At 53, she was still an attractive woman, though the years of royal responsibility had added fine lines around her eyes and a gravity to her expression that hadn't been there in her youth. Tonight, she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had spent decades learning how to carry herself with dignity under pressure. A soft knock at the door interrupted her preparations. Enter, Victoria called, expecting to see a member of the household staff with a final protocol reminder. Instead, Catherine appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a midnight blue gown that perfectly complemented her coloring. Her hair was arranged in an elegant updo, and she wore the sapphire tiara that had been her wedding gift from the king, another piece that had once belonged to Queen Isabella. Your Majesty, Catherine said formally, I hoped I might have a word before the evening begins. Victoria nodded to Margaret, who discreetly withdrew. When they were alone, Catherine moved closer, her expression earnest and troubled. I wanted you to know that I had no prior knowledge of His Majesty's intentions regarding the announcement tonight, and I want you to understand that I would never presume to accept any position or title that might diminish your own role in this family. Victoria studied the younger woman's face, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation. She found only genuine concern and what appeared to be considerable distress. Catherine, what the king chooses to do is his decision. You cannot be held responsible for his choices. But I can be responsible for my own response to them. Catherine moved to the window, gazing out at the courtyard where the last of the evening's guests were arriving. I've been thinking about what you said this afternoon, about honoring the contributions of all family members. You were right. Was I? Catherine turned back to face her. You've given 25 years of your life to this institution. You've supported the crown through scandals, political crises, and personal tragedies. You've represented the monarchy with grace and dignity even when, she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, even when you weren't given the recognition you deserved. Victoria felt something loosen in her chest. It was the first time anyone in the family had acknowledged what she had sacrificed, what she had contributed, what she had earned through decades of faithful service. And yet, Victoria said quietly, the king believes the monarchy's future lies with you. The king believes many things, Catherine said with careful diplomacy. But belief and wisdom are not always the same thing. Before Victoria could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the chamber. Edmund's voice came through the door, formal and commanding. Victoria, the guests are assembled. It's time. Victoria took a deep breath, checked her appearance one final time, and moved toward the door. Catherine fell into step beside her, and Together they walked through the corridors of Heir Palace toward what promised to be one of the most consequential evenings in the monarchy's recent history. The Great Hall had been transformed into a glittering showcase of royal grandeur. 200 guests, foreign diplomats, government ministers, business leaders, and representatives from various charitable organizations filled the space with an elegant buzz of conversation. The French ambassador and his delegation occupied the places of honor, while members of the British government and opposition leaders were strategically distributed throughout the room. King Edmund stood near the head table, resplendent in his formal military dress uniform, complete with the ceremonial medals and orders that represented his role as head of state. Prince William had positioned himself near the diplomatic section, engaging in what appeared to be animated conversation with the European Union's trade representative. Victoria and Catherine made their entrance together, and the room gradually quieted as guests noted their arrival. Victoria moved with the practiced grace of decades of royal events, nodding acknowledgments, pausing for brief conversations with key figures, and maintaining the pleasant but reserved expression that royal protocol demanded. But underneath her composed exterior, she was acutely aware of the undercurrents flowing through the room. She caught fragments of whispered conversations, references to newspaper headlines, speculation about palace intrigue, and barely concealed curiosity about the dynamics between the royal family members. "Your Majesty," the French ambassador approached with a courtly bow. "May I say how honored we are to be here tonight? The relationship between our nations has never been stronger." "Thank you, Ambassador Du Bois. France has always been a valued friend to the crown." As Victoria engaged in the diplomatic small talk that formed the backbone of such events, she was conscious of being watched, not just by the expected foreign dignitaries and government officials, but by members of the British press corps who had been granted access to cover the dinner. Their attention felt different tonight, more intense, more speculative, as if they were waiting for something to happen. The call to dinner came precisely at 8 o'clock. Guests moved toward their assigned seats according to the complex protocol that governed such events. Victoria found herself seated at the king's right hand, as tradition demanded, while Catherine was placed several seats away with the diplomatic wives. The arrangement seemed calculated to emphasize the traditional hierarchy, but Victoria wondered if it might actually highlight the contrast between established protocol and the changes Edmund was planning to announce. The first courses proceeded without incident. Conversation flowed around topics of mutual interest between the two nations, trade agreements, cultural exchanges, climate change initiatives. Edmund played the perfect host, charming and informed, guiding the discussion with the skill that came from decades of practice. But Victoria could sense his growing tension as the evening progressed. He checked his watch more frequently than usual, and she noticed the way his fingers drummed silently against the table when he thought no one was looking. Whatever he was planning to say, he was preparing himself for it with the intensity of a general before battle. The moment came between the main course and dessert. Edmund rose from his seat, and the room gradually fell silent as guests recognized the signal for a formal address. Victoria's heart began to pound as she realized there was no turning back from whatever was about to happen. "Distinguished guests, honored friends," Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast hall. "Tonight we celebrate the enduring friendship between our two great nations, but I also want to take this opportunity to speak about the future of our monarchy and the evolution of royal service in the 21st century. Victoria felt every muscle in her body tense. Around the room, she could see guests leaning forward slightly, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. For 8 centuries, the House of Blackthorn has adapted to changing times while maintaining the fundamental values that define our service to the realm. Tonight, I want to announce another such adaptation, one that reflects both our respect for tradition and our commitment to progress." Edmund paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests before coming to rest on Catherine. "The future of any institution depends on its ability to identify and elevate excellence, regardless of conventional expectations. Over the past 3 years, I have had the privilege of observing Princess Catherine's remarkable contributions to our national life. Her intelligence, her dedication, and her natural understanding of how monarchy can serve the modern world." Victoria's hands clenched in her lap as she realized what was coming. "Therefore, it is my pleasure to announce the creation of a new position within the royal hierarchy. Effective immediately, Princess Catherine will serve as Princess Regent for cultural and diplomatic affairs, with authority over all matters relating to the royal foundation, international cultural exchanges, and ceremonial protocol. This position carries with it precedence over all other non-hereditary roles within the monarchy. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of Edmund's words sank in. He had just elevated Catherine above every other member of the royal family except direct heirs to the throne. More devastating still, he had done so in front of 200 witnesses and members of the international press. The applause that eventually broke the silence was polite but uncertain. Many of the guests clearly didn't understand the full significance of what they had just heard, but those familiar with royal protocol were exchanging glances that ranged from surprised to scandalized. Catherine herself appeared stunned. She had risen from her seat when her name was mentioned, but now stood frozen, her face pale, and her eyes wide with what looked like horror rather than gratitude. It was clear that despite her earlier conversation with Victoria, she had not expected Edmund to proceed with such a dramatic announcement. Furthermore, Edmund continued, seemingly oblivious to the shock he had created, I want to announce that Princess Catherine will serve as my personal representative at next month's Commonwealth Conference, with full authority to negotiate cultural and educational agreements on behalf of the Crown. This was even more unprecedented. The Commonwealth Conference was one of the most important diplomatic events of the year, traditionally attended by the sovereign or the heir apparent. For Edmund to send Catherine instead sent a message about her elevated status that would reverberate throughout the diplomatic world. Victoria realized that every eye in the room was now on her, waiting to see how the queen consort would respond to being so publicly passed over. The expectation was clear. She should smile graciously, perhaps even join in the applause, demonstrating the royal family's unity and support for the king's decision. Instead, Victoria slowly rose from her seat. The hall fell silent again as guests sensed that something unscripted was about to happen. Your Majesty, Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. While I share your confidence in Princess Catherine's abilities, I must respectfully observe that such significant changes to royal protocol deserve careful consideration and consultation with all affected parties. The words were diplomatic, but their meaning was unmistakable. Victoria had just publicly challenged her husband's decision in front of foreign dignitaries and members of the press. The breach of royal etiquette was so severe that several guests audibly gasped. Edmund's face had gone completely still, his pale eyes fixed on Victoria with an expression that promised serious consequences for her unprecedented defiance. Nevertheless, he said carefully, the decision has been made. Indeed it has, Victoria replied, and there was something in her tone that made the room's tension ratchet even higher. As have many other decisions over the years, all in the service of what your Majesty believes to be the monarchy's best interests. She paused, looking around the room at the shocked faces of diplomats, ministers, and journalists who had expected a routine state dinner and instead found themselves witnessing what appeared to be the public dissolution of a royal marriage. I trust, Victoria continued, that Princess Catherine will bring the same dedication to her new responsibilities that has characterized her service thus far. And I'm certain that her expanded role will be illuminating for everyone involved. With that, Victoria inclined her head in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and dismissive, then resumed her seat. The message was clear. She would not create a scene by leaving, but neither would she pretend to support a decision that had been made without her consultation or consent. The remainder of the dinner proceeded with the kind of strained formality that occurs when everyone in a room knows they have witnessed something significant, but no one is quite sure what it means or how to react. Conversations were muted, glances were frequent and meaningful, and the atmosphere crackled with tension that no amount of diplomatic training could completely mask. Catherine remained visibly shaken throughout the final courses, barely touching her food and responding to attempts at conversation with distracted politeness. William appeared torn between supporting his wife and managing the diplomatic fallout from his father's announcement and his stepmother's response. As the evening finally drew to a close and guests began to depart, Victoria could hear the excited whispers of journalists who knew they had just witnessed a royal story that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. The careful image management that had characterized the monarchy for decades had just been shattered in the space of a single dinner. When the last guest had departed and the great hall stood empty except for palace staff clearing the remnants of the evening's disaster, Edmund approached Victoria with an expression that combined fury and something that might have been respect. We need to talk, he said quietly. Yes, Victoria replied. We do? But not here and not tonight. Some conversations require privacy, and others require preparation. Victoria, tomorrow, Edmund. In the morning, after we've both had time to consider the full implications of what happened here tonight. As Victoria walked through the empty corridors toward her chambers, she reflected on how completely the evening had changed everything. There would be no going back to the careful pretense that had characterized their marriage for 25 years. The truth was finally out in the open, and tomorrow they would all have to deal with the consequences of a royal family that had forgotten how to be a family at all. Dawn had barely broken over Heir Palace when Victoria's private secretary knocked urgently on her chamber door. Sarah Mitchell had served the Queen Consort for over a decade, and Victoria had never seen her looking quite so harried. The young woman's usually perfect composure was cracked around the edges, her auburn hair slightly disheveled despite the early hour. Your Majesty, Sarah said breathlessly, I'm afraid we have a situation. Victoria, who had been awake since 4 in the morning staring at the ceiling and replaying the previous evening's events, gestured for her secretary to enter. She was already dressed in a simple gray wool suit, having given up any pretense of sleep hours ago. Show me, Victoria said, settling into the armchair by the window. Sarah handed her a tablet displaying the morning's newspaper headlines. Victoria's heart sank as she read them. Royal Rift. Queen Consort challenges King in public showdown. Palace insiders. Marriage in crisis as Catherine elevated. Breaking. Victoria's rebellion rocks monarchy. Exclusive. 25 years of royal marriage crumbles in single evening. But it was the lead story in the Herald that made Victoria's blood run cold. Under the headline, The Letter That Changes Everything, the article featured a photograph of the private correspondence she had discovered the previous day, Edmund's decades-old confession about their loveless marriage. How did they get this? Victoria whispered, though part of her already suspected the answer. We're still investigating, Your Majesty, but... Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to say. The palace security team believes the leak came from within the royal household, someone with access to private quarters. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she continued reading. The article quoted extensively from Edmund's letter, painting their entire marriage as a calculated deception designed to provide the monarchy with a suitable queen consort while preserving the king's emotional loyalty to his deceased first wife. Worse still, it suggested that Catherine's elevation was the natural result of Edmund finally finding someone who could fill the void left by Isabella's death. The phone has been ringing constantly since 5 this morning, Sarah continued. Interview requests from every major news outlet in Europe and North America, plus formal inquiries from the Prime Minister's office and representatives from Commonwealth nations. And the King? His Majesty has been in emergency meetings with his advisors since dawn. Lord Pembroke arrived at 6, along with the constitutional lawyers and the palace communications team. Victoria felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. Lord Harrison Pembroke, the same man who had received Edmund's private confession 26 years ago, was now tasked with managing the public relations disaster that confession had created. The irony was almost too perfect. A sharp knock interrupted their conversation. Without waiting for permission to enter, King Edmund strode into the room, his face thunderous. He was followed by William, who looked like he hadn't slept at all, and, surprisingly, Catherine, who appeared pale but determined. Sarah, leave us, Edmund commanded. After the secretary departed, Edmund turned to face Victoria with an expression of barely controlled fury. How could you be so reckless? I beg your pardon. Don't play innocent with me, Victoria. That letter, my private correspondence from 26 years ago, is now splashed across every newspaper in the kingdom. Are you going to tell me that's a coincidence? Victoria rose from her chair, drawing herself up to her full height. Are you accusing me of leaking private documents to the press? I'm asking how a letter that was supposedly secured in the palace archives suddenly appeared in a tabloid newspaper less than 12 hours after our disagreement last evening. The letter wasn't in the palace archives, Victoria said quietly. It was among my personal correspondence, delivered by mistake according to my lady-in-waiting. Edmund's eyes narrowed. Delivered by whom? I don't know. Margaret said it was misfiled with my mail. William stepped forward, his lawyer's instincts clearly engaged. Father, we need to focus on damage control, not blame assignment. The letter is public now, regardless of how it got there. We need to decide how to respond. Catherine, who had been silent until now, moved closer to the group. Perhaps I should withdraw from the position His Majesty announced last night. Issue a statement saying that after careful consideration, I don't feel qualified to take on such expanded responsibilities. Absolutely not, Edmund said firmly. Backing down now would make us look weak and indecisive. And proceeding as planned makes us look dysfunctional and divided, Victoria countered. Which do you think serves the monarchy better? The tension in the room was palpable. Edmund and Victoria faced each other like adversaries preparing for battle, while William and Catherine stood caught between them, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. There's something else, William said reluctantly. The Prime Minister has requested an emergency meeting with you, Father. There are apparently concerns in Parliament about the constitutional implications of Catherine's new role. Edmund's jaw tightened. What concerns? Questions about precedence, about the legal authority of newly created titles, about whether such significant changes to royal protocol require parliamentary approval. Victoria felt a surge of grim satisfaction. She had suspected that Edmund's dramatic gesture would create legal complications, but she hadn't expected them to surface so quickly. Furthermore, William continued, there are suggestions that the timing of the announcement, combined with this morning's revelations about your marriage, creates the appearance of impropriety. What kind of impropriety? Catherine asked, though her tone suggested she already feared the answer. William exchanged an uncomfortable glance with his father before answering. The suggestion that your Majesty's personal feelings about Catherine may have influenced your official decisions about her role in the monarchy. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Victoria saw Catherine's face go white as she realized what was being suggested, that the king's affection for his daughter-in-law had crossed appropriate boundaries, leading him to make decisions based on emotion rather than institutional needs. That's preposterous, Edmund said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Is it? Victoria asked quietly. You've elevated a woman who's been in this family for 3 years to a position that supersedes the authority of someone who's served for 25. You've given her responsibilities that have traditionally belonged to the queen consort, and you've done so immediately after publicly acknowledging that your marriage has been emotionally vacant for decades. What exactly did you expect people to think? Edmund stared at his wife with an expression that combined shock and something that might have been recognition. For the first time in their marriage, Victoria had spoken the truth without diplomatic hedging or careful politeness, and the honesty seemed to have caught him completely off guard. I expected, he said slowly, that people would recognize Catherine's qualifications and understand that the monarchy must evolve to survive. And I expected, Victoria replied, that after 25 years of faithful service, I might be consulted before being passed over for someone who could be my daughter. Catherine stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly. Your Majesty, I never wanted this position. I never asked for it. And I certainly never intended for it to come at Victoria's expense. But you would have accepted it, Victoria said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she said finally. I honestly don't know what I would have done. There was something in her honesty that deflated some of Victoria's anger. Catherine was trapped in this situation just as much as Victoria herself was, caught between her loyalty to the king and her recognition of the unfairness being perpetrated. Well, Victoria said, it appears the decision has been made for all of us. She moved to her writing desk and pulled out a sheet of official stationery. I'm going to issue a statement clarifying my position on recent events. I suggest you all do the same. Victoria, Edmund said warningly, any statement you make will be scrutinized for signs of division within the family. Good, Victoria replied, already beginning to write. Because there is division within this family, and pretending otherwise hasn't served anyone well. William cleared his throat nervously. What kind of statement are you planning to make? Victoria looked up from her writing. An honest one. She returned to her composition, aware that the other three were exchanging worried glances behind her back. For 25 years, they had all become accustomed to Victoria's diplomatic discretion, her willingness to subordinate her own needs to the greater good of the monarchy. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who had finally decided that her own dignity was worth defending. I'm going to announce, Victoria said without looking up from her writing, that while I respect His Majesty's right to make decisions about royal titles and responsibilities, I cannot support changes that undermine the established order without proper consultation. I'm going to suggest that the recent announcements be suspended pending a comprehensive review of constitutional protocols and family input. You can't do that, Edmund said. Victoria set down her pen and looked directly at her husband. I can, and I will. Unless you prefer that I simply announce my intention to separate from the marriage entirely. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria had just raised the nuclear option, a royal divorce that would create a scandal unprecedented in modern monarchy. The threat hung in the air like a sword, and everyone in the room understood that she was perfectly serious. Catherine sank into a nearby chair, looking overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was unfolding around her. William ran his hands through his hair, clearly calculating the political ramifications of various scenarios. Edmund stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. "You wouldn't," he said finally. "Try me," Victoria replied. "I've spent 25 years pretending to be content with scraps of affection and recognition. I've smiled through countless public humiliations, accepted countless slights, and supported countless decisions that diminished my own role in this family. I will not do it anymore." She stood and moved toward the door, then paused to deliver one final statement. "You have until this afternoon to decide how you want to handle this situation. Either we work together to find a solution that respects everyone's contributions to this family, or we prepare for a very public and very messy separation. The choice is yours." As Victoria left the room, she heard Catherine's voice behind her, soft but clear. "She's right, you know. About all of it." Victoria didn't stop to hear Edmund's response. She had finally said everything she had been thinking for decades, and now it was up to the rest of them to decide whether the House of Blackthorn could survive the truth. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of her private study as Victoria put the finishing touches on her statement to the press. It was measured, dignified, and absolutely devastating to the carefully constructed image of royal unity that the palace had spent years cultivating. More importantly, it was honest, perhaps the first completely honest thing she had said publicly in her entire marriage. As she prepared to send the statement to the palace communications office, Victoria reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of 48 hours. The woman who had discovered that letter in her jewelry box was gone, replaced by someone who had finally decided that the truth was worth more than the comfortable lie she had been living. The House of Blackthorn was about to face its greatest crisis in generations, and, for the first time in her marriage, Victoria was ready to fight for her place in it. 3 months later, the autumn leaves drifted across the grounds of Heir Palace as Victoria stood in the private garden that had become her refuge during the most tumultuous period in the monarchy's modern history. The formal gardens were immaculate as always, but there was a different quality to the silence that surrounded the ancient stone walls, a sense of change that went deeper than the seasonal transformation of the landscape. The crisis that had begun with a leaked letter and a disastrous state dinner had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated. What had started as a personal conflict between husband and wife had become a constitutional question that had engaged Parliament, the courts, and ultimately the people of the realm in a debate about the nature of modern monarchy. Victoria's public statement 3 months ago had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Her dignified but pointed critique of the king's decision-making process had resonated far beyond palace walls, sparking a national conversation about transparency, accountability, and the role of women in royal institutions. The response had surprised everyone, perhaps most of all Victoria herself. "Your Majesty?" Lady Margaret's voice interrupted her thoughts. "His Majesty has arrived for your meeting." Victoria turned from the garden window, smoothing the lines of her navy blue dress. The past 3 months had changed her appearance in subtle but noticeable ways. There was a new confidence in her bearing, a directness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. She had stopped trying to make herself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. King Edmund entered the private sitting room that had become their meeting place for these difficult conversations. He looked older than he had 3 months ago, the silver in his hair more pronounced, new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. The crisis had aged him in ways that 25 years of royal responsibility had not. "Victoria," he said formally, taking the chair across from her usual spot by the fireplace. "Edmund." She settled into her chair, noting how different these interactions felt now that they had abandoned the pretense of marital harmony. "I trust the Constitutional Review Committee has reached its conclusions?" "They have." Edmund handed her a leather-bound report. "The findings are comprehensive." Victoria accepted the document, noting its substantial weight. Over the past 3 months, a special parliamentary committee had conducted an extensive review of royal protocols, constitutional law, and the circumstances surrounding the creation of Catherine's new title. The process had been unprecedented, forcing the monarchy to submit to a level of scrutiny that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The summary? Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the major conclusions. The committee determined that while the Crown retains the constitutional authority to create new titles and assign royal responsibilities, such decisions must be made through established consultation processes that include all affected parties. Edmund paused, his expression carefully neutral. They also concluded that the manner in which Catherine's elevation was announced created the appearance of arbitrary decision-making that undermined public confidence in royal judgment. Victoria felt a surge of vindication, though she kept her expression composed. And their recommendations? Catherine's title of Princess Regent has been modified to Princess Royal for cultural affairs, with a more limited scope of authority. The original designation is being restructured to ensure appropriate consultation and parliamentary oversight of future similar decisions. And Catherine's response to these changes? Edmund's expression softened slightly. She's relieved, actually. The past 3 months have been extremely difficult for her. The speculation about her relationship with me, the suggestions that she somehow manipulated her way into an elevated position, it's taken a considerable toll. Victoria felt a pang of sympathy for her daughter-in-law. Catherine had become collateral damage in a conflict that had its roots in decades of accumulated resentments and unaddressed truths. The young woman had handled the scrutiny with remarkable grace, but the cost had been evident in her increasingly rare public appearances and the careful distance she had maintained from palace politics. There's something else, Edmund continued. The committee made a specific recommendation regarding your role. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Oh, they suggested that the position of Queen Consort has been underutilized, and that your experience and demonstrated judgment make you uniquely qualified for expanded responsibilities in areas of charitable work, cultural diplomacy, and constitutional continuity. The irony was not lost on Victoria. After 3 months of public crisis, she was finally being offered the recognition and authority she had sought for 25 years. The vindication felt both satisfying and bittersweet. And your response to this recommendation? Edmund was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. When he looked up, there was something in his expression that Victoria had never seen before, what might have been genuine respect. I've come to realize that I've made some significant errors in judgment over the years. Not just about constitutional protocols or royal titles, but about the people closest to me. Edmund, no, let me finish. He leaned forward, his voice taking on an intensity that made Victoria pay closer attention. The letter that started all of this, my confession about our marriage, about my inability to love you as you deserved, it was written by a man who was drowning in grief and too young to understand what he was throwing away. Victoria felt her heart constrict. What are you saying? I'm saying that 26 years ago, I was so focused on what I had lost that I couldn't see what I was being offered. You came into my life at a time when I was determined not to be healed, and I punished you for virtues that should have been treasured. The admission hung between them like a bridge that could either be crossed or burned. Victoria searched Edmund's face, looking for signs of the calculated manipulation that had characterized so many of their interactions over the years. Instead, she found something that looked remarkably like honesty. You're telling me this now because of the constitutional crisis? Because Parliament recommended that you treat me with more respect? I'm telling you this because 3 months of watching you stand up for yourself made me realize what I've been blind to for 25 years. You weren't just a suitable queen consort, Victoria. You were an extraordinary woman who deserved an extraordinary marriage, and I was too damaged and too selfish to give you what you deserved. Victoria felt tears threatening for the first time since this crisis had begun. And Catherine? Edmund sighed deeply. Catherine is a remarkable young woman who reminds me of the optimism and hope I felt when I was younger. My affection for her was never inappropriate, but it was unfair, to her, to William, and most of all to you. She became a symbol of possibilities I thought I had lost, and I confused that symbolism with reality. She'll make an excellent Princess Royal, Victoria said carefully. She will, but within appropriate boundaries, with proper support, and without the weight of expectations that should never have been placed on her shoulders. They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the magnitude of what had just been acknowledged. Outside, the palace staff continued their daily routines, but inside this room, a marriage was being examined and possibly rebuilt from its foundations. Where does this leave us, Edmund? That depends on you, he said quietly. The constitutional crisis is resolved. Catherine's position has been appropriately restructured, Your role has been formally recognized and expanded, and the monarchy will emerge from this stronger and more accountable than before. But our marriage, that's between us to determine. Victoria considered his words carefully. The woman she had been 3 months ago might have eagerly accepted this olive branch, grateful for any acknowledgement of her worth. The woman she had become was more cautious, more aware of her own value, and less willing to accept gestures that might be motivated by political necessity rather than genuine feeling. I need time, she said finally. Of course. And I need to see changes, not just hear promises. 25 years of disappointment can't be erased with a single conversation, no matter how honest. Edmund nodded. I understand. But Edmund. Victoria looked directly into his pale blue eyes. I'm willing to try. Not because Parliament recommended it, and not because the monarchy needs us to appear united, but because I think we might both be different people than we were when this marriage began. A knock at the door interrupted them. William and Catherine entered together, both looking apprehensive about what they might find. The past 3 months had been difficult for the younger couple as well, as they had tried to balance their loyalty to family with their recognition of the injustices that had been perpetrated. How did the meeting go? William asked carefully. Productively, Edmund replied. The Constitutional Review has provided us with a framework for moving forward that addresses everyone's concerns. Catherine stepped forward, her expression serious. Victoria, I want you to know how sorry I am for the way this all unfolded. I should have spoken up sooner, should have insisted on proper consultation before accepting any expanded role. You were put in an impossible position, Catherine. None of this was your fault. But I could have handled it differently. I could have been more aware of how my actions might affect you. Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile she had shared with her daughter-in-law in months. We've all learned things about ourselves these past 3 months. Some of those lessons have been painful, but perhaps they've also been necessary. William looked between his father and stepmother with obvious relief. So the family survives this. The family evolves from this, Victoria corrected. We're not the same people we were 3 months ago, and we're certainly not the same royal family. But perhaps that's not a bad thing. As evening fell over Heir Palace, Victoria stood once again at her window, looking out over the gardens that had witnessed centuries of royal dramas. The crisis that had begun with a discovered letter had ended with discoveries far more valuable. The recognition of her own worth, the acknowledgement of her contributions, and, perhaps most surprisingly, the possibility of a marriage that might finally be built on truth rather than duty. The House of Blackthorn had weathered its greatest modern crisis, but, more importantly, it had learned that survival sometimes requires the courage to tell uncomfortable truths. Victoria had found her voice, Catherine had found her appropriate place, and Edmund had found the wisdom that comes from nearly losing something precious through neglect. The monarchy would continue, but it would do so with new understanding of what it meant to honor the contributions of all who served it. And in the private quarters of the palace, a marriage that had begun as a political arrangement was tentatively exploring what it might become if built instead on mutual respect, hard-won wisdom, and the kind of love that grows slowly but endures. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time in 25 years, Victoria felt genuinely hopeful about what that future might hold.